For decades, one explanation has dominated every headline, every policy debate, and every conspiracy theory about U.S. Venezuela relations. The story seems obvious. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. The United States consumes more energy than almost any nation on Earth. Conflict, sanctions, pressure, it must all be about oil. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If this were really about oil, then none of what happened after 2020, and especially after 2026, should have happened at all. Because by the time U.S. forces moved decisively against Venezuela's leadership, by the time Washington tightened financial chokeholds rather than energy blockades, by the time global markets barely flinched, oil had already stopped being the main reason Venezuela mattered. So why did tensions escalate instead of fading? Why did the U.S. double down on pressure even as Venezuelan oil became less essential? And why does this conflict look eerily similar to other power struggles unfolding right now, from Russia to Iran to the South China Sea? To understand the truth, we have to rewind. Not just to Chavez, not just to Maduro, but to a time when oil wasn't just a commodity, it was power itself. And we have to follow a trail of decisions that transformed Venezuela from an energy giant into a warning sign for the modern world. In the early 20th century, Venezuela was not poor. It was quiet, underdeveloped, but sitting on something the world was beginning to realize could reshape empires. By the 1920s, American and European companies were drilling aggressively across Venezuelan territory. The country quickly became one of the world's largest oil exporters, supplying energy to fuel factories, militaries, and post-war reconstruction. By the mid-20th century, Venezuela was rich, at least on paper. Its oil revenues funded highways, skyscrapers, and one of Latin America's strongest middle classes. Caracas earned the nickname, the Miami of South America. Venezuelans traveled freely. Imported goods were cheap. The bolivar was strong. And crucially, Venezuela aligned itself with U.S. financial and energy systems. But this prosperity came with a hidden flaw. The Venezuelan economy became almost entirely dependent on one thing. One price. One export. Oil wasn't just dominant, it crowded out everything else. Agriculture shrank. Manufacturing stagnated. Institutions learned to distribute oil money instead of creating value. And when oil prices rose, the system looked brilliant. When they fell, the entire country shook. By the 1990s, inequality had returned with a vengeance. Despite decades of oil wealth, poverty remained widespread. Corruption hollowed out trust. Political elites rotated power while average Venezuelans saw little change. Enter Hugo Chavez. A former military officer with revolutionary rhetoric, Chavez didn't just promise reform, he promised revenge against the old system. His message was simple and powerful. Venezuela's oil had been stolen, by foreign companies, by domestic elites, by the United States. Oil would now belong to the people. Once in power, Chavez nationalized oil assets, tightened state control over PDVSA, the National Oil Company, and redirected oil revenues into massive social programs. For a time it worked. Oil prices surged in the 2000s. China's growth exploded demand. Cash flooded government accounts. Chavez became a global symbol of defiance. He challenged Washington openly. He built alliances with Russia, Iran, and Cuba. He framed Venezuela as the front line of a new anti-American order. And the U.S. watched, wary, irritated, but restrained. Because oil still mattered. As long as Venezuela remained a major supplier, pressure had limits. The problem with building a political system on oil wealth is simple. You don't control the price. When oil prices collapsed in the mid-2010s, Venezuela's economy didn't slow, it imploded. Production fell due to mismanagement. Maintenance collapsed. Skilled engineers fled the country. PDVSA, once one of the world's most respected oil companies, became a hollowed-out shell. Then Chavez died. And Nicolas Maduro inherited a system that only functioned when oil was expensive. And oil was no longer expensive. Inflation exploded. Food shortages spread. Blackouts became routine. Millions fled. This was the moment many assumed the U.S. would back off. After all, Venezuela's oil output was falling fast. American shale production was booming. Energy independence was no longer theoretical. But instead of easing pressure, Washington escalated. This is where the traditional oil narrative breaks down. U.S. sanctions against Venezuela were no longer primarily about energy access. They were about financial systems. The U.S. targeted banking access, dollar clearing, sovereign debt, individual officials' assets. Oil exports were restricted not to secure supply, but to deny revenue. Because by this point, Venezuelan oil was no longer critical to global markets. Other suppliers filled the gap. Strategic reserves existed. Renewables were expanding. Oil shocks didn't materialize. And something crucial changed. Venezuela stopped being an energy threat and became a political contagion. Washington feared precedent more than supply. A failed Petro state collapsing into chaos. Deepening ties with U.S. rivals. A model of sanctions resistance. The issue wasn't oil. It was control over rules. By 2026, the situation crossed a line. Years of failed negotiations. Repeated elections with disputed legitimacy. Humanitarian collapse spilling across borders. But the decisive shift came when intelligence assessments concluded something unsettling. Venezuela was no longer stabilizable through economic pressure alone. Oil revenues were too weak. Sanctions loopholes were expanding. External actors were entrenching themselves. And critically, the cost of intervention had fallen. Global oil markets barely reacted to Venezuelan disruptions. That fact alone would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. This is why 2026 matters. Not because of oil seizures. Not because of energy security. But because Venezuela no longer held the leverage it once did. For the first time, the U.S. could act decisively without fearing global economic shock. That was the real turning point. The aftermath wasn't stability. It was fragmentation. State institutions weakened further. Regional powers maneuvered. Venezuelan society remained deeply scarred. But on the global stage something else happened. Markets adapted instantly. No oil panic. No price explosion. No global recession. And that sent a chilling message to other resource-dependent states. Oil no longer guarantees protection. Over the years, every fix followed the same flawed logic. More control, worsened production. More sanctions, deepened civilian suffering. Negotiations without trust, collapsed. Oil for aid schemes, corrupted. The underlying issue was never resolved. Venezuela wasn't just mismanaged. It was structurally trapped in a system where oil masked institutional weakness, until it couldn't anymore. Venezuela is not unique. Look around the world. Russia depends on energy revenues, and faces financial isolation. Iran trades oil under sanctions, with diminishing leverage. Petrostates across Africa and the Middle East face the same dilemma. As energy transitions accelerate, the power of oil declines. Not overnight, but decisively. Control now comes from financial systems, currency dominance, technology, supply chains. Oil still matters, but it no longer protects regimes from collapse. So, what is the truth about U.S. Venezuela tensions? It was never just about oil. Oil was the entry point, the amplifier, the illusion of permanence. But the real conflict was about who controls economic rules, who survives when commodities lose power, who adapts, and who doesn't. Venezuela didn't fall because it had oil. It fell because it built everything on oil, and the world moved on. Final takeaways. Natural resources create wealth, but not resilience. In the modern world, financial systems matter more than physical commodities. When leverage disappears, power shifts brutally fast. If oil can lose its power this quickly, what happens to the next country betting everything on a single resource? And what happens when the world decides it no longer needs what you control? If you want more deep dive documentaries uncovering the hidden economic forces shaping global power, subscribe to the channel. Because the stories that truly change the world are rarely the ones we're told at first.